it's already been extremely beneficial to me. I hope I can contribute to it being beneficial to you. I think it was last week or the week before, Joe Robertson, David and I got on a call together and decided how we were going to coordinate our talks and who would go first and who would go second. It seemed logical for David to go before me, but now I'm starting to think that was a really stupid move on my part. As you'll see in a minute, how do you follow that? But I will try to do justice to Geoversive and to Joe and David and to all of you. I will start by telling you a little bit about my professional experience in the issue of climate change and remote sensing, and then I'm going to go back to the summer of 1969. Sounds like a song, but it was a monumental moment in my life. As a kid, I was 7 years old, and I'll talk about why that was so important, but it gets back to this slide that I've got here. I'm a geologist by training, specialized in plate tectonics and climate change. Did a lot of work with the U.S. Geological Survey. Was my home agency. I ended up drinking too much one night and telling somebody that we had a leadership problem, and next thing I knew I was in management. That following Monday taught me not to drink and think. And from that point, I ended up at the Department of the Interior from the U.S. Geological Survey as the Secretary of the Interior Science Advisor for Climate Change during first the Bush II administration and then the Obama administration. And then I had the privilege of serving President Obama as the lead for the climate change programs across the federal government. I was the executive director of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. It's a $2.5 billion annual budgeted climate change science program that includes funding from all the major agencies and a lot of the small ones, 13 federal agencies, but it includes the funding that many of you may have had for climate research through the National Science Foundation, NOAA, NASA, and EPA, Department of Agriculture, and the Department of the Interior. I want to just say for a moment, going back to what has happened this last week with the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement, that I played a minor part in the establishment of our arrangements and agreements one-on-one with the Chinese and the Indians and other countries as well during the Obama administration. And I really can't tell you how disappointed I am in what's evolved, both from an intellectual standpoint, but just a humanistic standpoint, that what we have done is really, we've given up our leadership role as a country, in my opinion, in the global circuit. We are giving up our leadership as a global superpower and as a country that can lead by example. And in doing so, I promise to work with everybody else and every other country in order to continue the spirit and the intent of the agreement, whether the United States directly participates politically or not. And I hope you will all do the same, because this is bigger than just our country. This is about the globe. And believe me, we are really all in this together, because it's dire. I hate to say that as a scientist. I don't like to use words like that. But I have to tell you that there was greater consensus about the issue of climate change. 97% of all scientists who understand and agree in principle as to what the drivers are, human activity, as well as the nature of the problem and where tipping points may be, the status and trends of different physical and biological processes. We get that. When I was going through college as an undergraduate and then getting my master's and finally my PhD, you know, there were actually more people, more geologists that actually disagreed with plate tectonics than we see today, that dissent from climate change and the realities of it. About 80% of all the geologists back in the 1990s believed that the Earth was driven by plate tectonics. But did we ever argue about that? It's kind of an interesting thing to me that this paradigm we live in is so emotionally charged, and there's a tendency not to listen to the science, which I find most disappointing, and I'll get back to that in a minute. Let me turn and be a little bit more positive now. This slide here, the picture in the background is actually of Edwin Buzz Aldrin on the moon in the summer of 1969. And if you can see the reflection in his visor, that's the commander, Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on space, who actually happens to be a very distant relative of mine, thanks to Ancestry.com. And it's peer-reviewed, so you can trust it. I watched that summer. I did not take my eyes off that TV. There was incredible coverage with people like Walter Cronkite. Sorry about that. And it's one of the few times, other than the Kennedy assassination, that I think you'll ever see Walter Cronkite being emotional is when Neil Armstrong took those first steps on the moon. What a moment that was, not just for a country, but the Earth and for science. And as a kid, that's when I decided, number one, I was going to be an astronaut, but number two, I wanted to be a science astronaut. Unfortunately, I never made it that far, probably because of that drinking problem I told you about before, and bad eyes. But I knew people like Jack Schmitt and Gene Cernan and others who did walk on the moon. And it's just amazing what we can do scientifically and technologically when we apply ourselves to problems and all work together towards that common cause. So that's why I wanted to show this. The other point is that I'd like to make is you look at the little CubeSat guys in the background here, and I think you talked more about this yesterday, is that as we really start to continue, I hope, our expansion out into space, our adventure with going into space, both within the solar system but beyond, that we never forget to turn around and look back at where we came from. Because frankly, this is our only home today. And we are learning so much from remote sensing and the various assets that are spaceborne as well as airborne about how the planet operates, that it's just thoroughly amazing to me. After my stint at the Obama administration, I left government after approximately 25 years, and I've opened up a consulting firm. I work mostly internationally, but we have some local constituents in the United States, including the state of Montana, where we're doing the first climate assessment of the state. And I have to tell you that there is a real need to better engage the science and the science community with the people that are actually making decisions. And David Thorson was talking about that a moment ago, about who are these stakeholders. Well, they could be a sailor, they could be me, they could be you, it could be communities, villages, cities, states, the list goes on. But what I have to tell you is that for the most part, and I think it's part of the problem we're having, for example, with the issue of climate change, we are still not, as a global society, communicating effectively enough about what it is in the science that we see that is useful and usable by decision makers. And a big part of what I do in my company is to build that bridge between the science community, the great people like you doing the research, and the people that actually have to make decisions, and finding ways to translate science into knowledge and that knowledge into action. In fact, that's our mantra in my company, is science, knowledge, action. So quickly, let me just talk a little bit about this. I've already talked about this part, increased global warming, whether you like that term or not, and frankly, I don't. It's climate change. It's a reality, and this is a worldwide problem. I don't think we need to talk more about that. I do want to point out that much of what we see in terms of the impacts and effects of climate change, we tend to talk about climate as a global force, or in the global sense. And the global models are great because it's actually, ironically, easier to model at the global scale than it is to understand at the detailed or the local scale. And you know the reasons for that as well as I do, if not better, many of which are that it's just hard to get high-res information for or from models at the local scale. But the bottom line, the mantra holds. The impacts and the forces of climate change may originate at the global level, but the majority of the impacts and effects that need to be dealt with from that global force are felt and dealt with at the local level. Here's an example of the local level. This is near Shishmaref on the North Slope. These were consolidated sediments, frozen sediments in permafrost until recently. Now they have thawed. They've become much more unconsolidated and vulnerable to erosion. Without sea ice in the summer coming into shore, increased strong storms that we're seeing, which are effectively the force of hurricanes, are impacting the North Slope and hitting directly into the shoreline. And we're getting pulse erosion, in some cases erosion of the beach and sea interface, by 150 meters or more overnight or within a week. And that's one of the problems with Shishmaref and other localities, is that they are just so vulnerable and so susceptible to these pulse erosion events that are really not only exacerbated but triggered by climate change, that we're actually right now through the Department of the Interior paying to move entire villages from where they are inland into what we're calling protected zones. But yet we're really not sure, are these going to be protected zones for the future, or are we going to end up moving these communities one by one, infinitum, until we actually deal and solve this climate problem that we're dealing with. It's Shishmaref today, but these kinds of problems are going to be Miami, it's going to be Bangladesh of the near future as well. So I just want to point out that translating complex science into more useful and usable knowledge to support decision-making actions is really needed. And again, building that bridge between you, the science community, and they, the Davids or the others of the world that make decisions, is really, really critical. We've developed a lot of different methodologies and frameworks for how to bridge that science to action or science to decision-making gap. This was an example from the work we're doing in Montana, where we're working with a set of people in the irrigation and water supply communities. And to make a long story short, what we found is whether a scientist working from forces through variables, looking at impacts and effects, you ultimately end up with what you perceive to be consequences. The same is true of the decision-making community. They start out with decision-making challenges and arrive from right to left to consequences as well. It's at that nexus of consequences that I think we start the dialogue between the science community and the decision-making community. And it's not that, lo and behold, we automatically just at the end of the process put a decision maker and a scientist into a room together and have a cage fight. What we need to do is start at the beginning, where right from the beginning we have scientists from the community sitting down with the decision makers right at the start of any of these efforts and build this bridge together. It sounds trivial, but it's very hard to do, but it's necessary. Now on to the observational piece of what I wanted to talk about. Images of glaciers, the Landsat 7, 8, 9 thematic mappers and imagery. I used to use a lot of it myself, especially from old Landsat 5 and Landsat 7. We've got a plethora of information that is now available to the public, in many cases for free, and I think that's a great contribution. There's also a private sector market, I think, for other imagery out there that's very useful as well. But when it comes to thematic mapping or to regional scale observations and status and trends of various elements of the science, this is a great way to go. This is the starting point. But what we're, again, finding is that there's a need to get down to the detailed local level, that this scale of information is a great first pass, but it just doesn't solve the problems, the specific problems that decision makers have at the local scale. It's our hope, it's my hope, that the world of CubeSat-like or microsatellites will help to solve some of this problem in the equation. But I think it's just an interesting line of thought to take and to help us figure out what is it that we need for the future. What are these microsatellites and why are they so important? But let's cut to the chase in many cases. What's the cost benefit? Are there going to be evolving economies of scales that are going to allow us to put a significant number of these small assets up into orbit or up into the sky that are going to be able to provide us cost beneficial and timely return of information on things like soil moisture, temperature, pressure, whatever it may be, that will be directly useful and usable by the decision-making communities of the future. As part of NASA's CubeSat launch initiative 2017, there's a myriad of different universities and even high schools that are affiliated with the CubeSat observations system or network. I have not worked, even though we're doing work in Montana, with the RadSat-U at Montana State University, but we are beginning to talk with other universities around the country to see if there are some proof of concepts out there that we can use as part of our assessment of climate change impacts that can help us to get down to the local level and provide things like soil moisture and rapid returns and refreshes on changes in things like soil moisture that will help farmers, ranchers, town managers in a state like Montana, which is it's kind of an ideal place to work because it's big, but the climate regimes are big as well, and the population centers are small. So you can really focus down from the state level into the local level fairly effectively without a lot of noise. So our hope is that by being able to do this, by being able to partner with some of these different microsatellite opportunities that are coming up into the now and in the future, we will be able to solve one of the major dilemmas that we have in the conveyance of science into knowledge, into action. And that, frankly, is we lack the ability right now to empower the decision-making communities to take on some of this themselves. Now, this is not a replacement for science. I am not saying that in any way, shape, or form. There's always a need to start with the rock bottom, basic fundamental information about how the system works. And we're going to need you as scientists to be doing not only that, but also to serve in essence as translators of that information into knowledge. Knowledge that can be coupled with indigenous, local, traditional knowledge forms and other kinds of knowledge. Knowledge like what Dave Thorson talked about when he sailed around and made observations of the environment he was in. All of this information is very valuable to decision makers. And the more we can actually translate that science into a form of knowledge that can be complemented by these other forms of knowledge, believe me, that we will gain more trust and understanding of what it is you actually are doing and how valuable that research is from those people that actually vote and put the right people, hopefully in the future, into elected offices where they'll be better informed of the true value of science. I honestly believe if we do this right, that at the end of the day, we will not only be empowering communities to make better decisions, we will start a new renaissance of science, one in which more resources will come to the scientific community to do the things that we need to do, including the basic fundamental research that needs to occur in order to make those new intellectual and scientific paradigm kinds of leaps. I really thought when I was a kid sitting in front of that TV that my generation, the next generation after Cousin Neil's, would be, how'd you like I threw that in there? Maybe you'll remember that instead of Dave's slides. I really thought my generation would be the one to go to Mars. And I can't tell you how disappointed I was and still am that we didn't continue to support something we started back in the 1950s and 1960s through the 70s to where we are today. We've made some great strides, there's no question about that. We could have done better. I hope and I pray that Paris and what has happened last week will not be the beginning of another end of something that we started with Apollo. We need to make these advances, and the United States needs to be a leader, not the only leader, but one of many that can lead the way scientifically to that next shift. And just being here today, I've heard some great examples of where we can lead and why we should be leading. So again, I'll stop with that. The empowerment piece is huge, but as I said before, there's still much to observe and learn. And as we go out into space and you do great things and bringing us out through the solar system and beyond, please don't forget to turn around and think about how we can use those same assets to look back towards Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much for standing up, and I think you should actually go beyond. It's not enough to have satellites, but the data should be for everybody. Everybody should be able to receive the data, because the data is as good as the data what you get. Curating data is a very dangerous enterprise. You have to make sure that the curated data is actually the same data, but the collected data, and people might not believe that data is data. That's what we learned from CTBTO
Yeah.
and other data collection agencies.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I just want to say as a plug for public-private partnerships, that one of the things I think is really needed is somewhere within that affiliation of working with and across the federal sector into the state level, as well as the private sector, including the NGOs, that we've got to build some sort of element, some place that can be an objective third party to all of what we're working on, and essentially provide a good housekeeping seal of approval for the information that's coming through. But it's got to be objective, impartial, and extremely rigorous. But it's really necessary. My biggest fear where we are right now in the climate community, in the private sector, is the growing number of these cottage firms, these private firms, that all use different models, QA/QC protocols and standards that really aren't things that can be compared from one place to another. It's like apples and oranges from one model, little cottage model to another. There's a big need for the private sector in all of this, but they have to be part of something bigger than just the private sector. We need to make sure that in a public-private partnership, we've got the ability to coordinate and infuse all these pieces together more effectively.
Yes, noise is the big enemy.
Yeah.
Yes, hi there. As I said yesterday in my talk, show Earth, a organization like ours, scientifically oriented with space aspects, we're interested in the Earth observing part for scientific reasons, and we can talk about that later. Can you speak more to the prospects and challenges of combining the remote sensing satellite type of imagery and measurements with the in situ measurements? We do that at Mars as well. We want to do that at Europa with both orbiters and landers, and other destinations, clearly on the moon as well. And so here on Earth, this is something where you have in situ measurements and other types of studies that can help provide ground truth for remote sensing, and other ways that they can be complementary. But how do you organize that in an effective way?
That is a great question, and I was hoping you would have the answer for that. But let me give you an example of where we're trying to do that and how we're trying to take it from a local level of integration to the national level of integration. The work we're doing with the state of Montana, we're producing, as I said, the first ever climate assessment for the state of Montana. A lot of what's in there is focused on three major sectors: water, forests, and agriculture. All three of them, as you can imagine, have a need for not only hydrologic information, but hydroclimatic information, much of which in Montana is scant and it's in situ. Take the issue of soil moisture. What we would like to do, and what we've started to do as part of a pilot study with the state of Montana, working with my colleagues at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, is to incorporate that information into the national climate assessment. But it's not just the conclusions, the synthesis, or the in situ measurements piece. We're starting to work in trying to develop a CubeSat network that will help us to determine soil moisture readings, status and trends that can be refreshed on some periodic basis. We would like to be able to, at the state level, develop the methodologies that calibrate and validate what we're receiving from the spaceborne assets and the airborne assets with the ground truthing, which, as I pointed out to you, to be honest, is scant. In developing that methodology, we have developed also sort of an informal arrangement with USGCRP and the National Climate Assessment, which is mandated by Congress, to include the methodologies of integration that we develop at the state level back to the national level. Now, whether they turn around at the national level and say, yes, this kind of methodology is what we want for all 50 states, if you're going to partake in the National Climate Assessment, and oh, by the way, if you want money from NSF and the climate change programs in the future, or NASA or NOAA or any of the affiliates of USGCRP, that's another story. But what we're trying to do is start at the local level and show how we can make that systems integration and bring that methodology up to the national level and see if it's of value to them. So far, the public-private partnership, and I'm going to criticize my own administration of the former 8 years, we tried to do that too much top-down. We tried to do it from inside the Beltway and mandate it outside. It doesn't work that way. You've got to have an infusion of the bottom-up systems integration with the top-down guidance and find the sweet spots in between. I would love to talk to you about that because clearly you've thought about this and we need your help. It's one of the biggest problems we face.
Last question, Sidi.
So when you talk about converting knowledge into action, what could be low-hanging fruits for the private sector involvement?
I'm not going to sit here and give you examples of what they are because they vary from place to place and problem to problem. But I think one of the first things we need to do is to sit down with the decision makers and find out what are their decision-making challenges at any scale in any place. And as part of that, bring in the science community into that initial discussion. As an example of this, for the Arctic community, which I'm still part of, through the Arctic Council, the Circum 8 Arctic countries, 6 observer nations, not observers, permanent indigenous participants, and then a multitude of observing countries and organizations. We developed a workshop, a conference that we held in Virginia in April on the Arctic to define, just as you asked, what are some of the low-hanging fruit in that area of knowledge that we can easily take into the action phase and support, with very scant resources effectively, though, the use of that knowledge for better decision making. How do you define better? Better than what? Better than what you did before? Where I'm going to take this now is that, just very quickly, the real issue is that, as I said, the question you're asking about what are those low-hanging fruit, we could talk about that offline. The more important question is to ask the decision-making community, did the information we actually provide you as part of that low-hanging fruit help you to actually make better decisions? And if so, how do you measure that? That's adaptive management, and that is part of our whole methodology that needs to occur. It's not a one-shot pulse with the science community where you throw the science over the transom and it's magically created into knowledge that then is used to take action and everybody goes their own separate ways. You've got to evaluate that decision-making process to see if the science made a difference and bring it back to the science community again for round 2. And I have yet to see a case, even with the low-hanging fruit, where we didn't need a round 2, where the decision makers said, we would like to try this again because this helped, but we think we can do better. Let's go back to the science community and find out what's missing. And in many cases, what we found so far is that there are just gaps in our scientific understanding that scientists will tell you, if we had additional resources, we'd work on this. But right now, we can't do more than what we're already doing. We're already being asked to do more with less. That's where I see the science renaissance. If we do this right and show that there's a cost benefit and a benefit to life and humanity, I honestly believe that we will get the advocates we need and that the world needs, not just the science community, to advocate for those resources to fill those gaps, because they'll see the direct value of the science in that decision making. I have to be honest with you, right now in most cases, we're just not doing a good enough job of advocating for why the science is so important to understanding, believe it or not, climate change, but the impacts and effects that people and communities are feeling due to climate change. It's still not good enough.
It's great, finished. Thank you very much.